Okay, thanks, Emma. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming along this afternoon to SURF's Hustings meeting. Can I, first of all, on your behalf, issue personal and organisational thanks to the politicians we've got working with us this afternoon. We'll work through them in alphabetical order and hopefully be very interested in what they have to say. I'm sure we will. My colleagues Derek and Emma will be helping me out this afternoon as we work our way through this. This is, I suppose, for all of us, a fairly unusual set of circumstances. These meetings are obviously far better when we're actually in a room and you can get the vibe of what's going on and you can see people and realise how the feeling of the meeting's working out. But from SURF's point of view, this is a great opportunity for us to hear what the politicians have to say in relation to the field of regeneration, and for us to put questions to them which hopefully will help them understand where we're coming from and help us understand where they're coming from. We have 5 minutes for each of the politicians this afternoon to put their point from the point of view of their political party. After that, we will have time for questions, and my colleague Emma will help me work my way through the questions. We'll round up with a chance for the politicians to wind up what they've heard and respond perhaps in relation to some of the questions and some of the points their colleagues have made. So the position we're in now is that my colleague Derek will take us through a brief summary of SURF's manifesto process. This, as you'll recall, is what SURF does at most elections. We try and organise our members to help us understand where they want the views they want SURF to put forward, and then we articulate that. So Derek, will you take us through the manifesto process and let folk know a summary of where we stand?
Thank you, Brian. Yes, very happy to do that. So we actually planned a series of 13 consultation workshops with our network to start in March of last year. And then, of course, the pandemic happened, and we swapped that for dozens of one-to-one interviews with a cross-section of the SURF network, and we also invited written submissions for the remainder of 2020. So we interviewed quite a wide range of regeneration practitioners and experts, from community volunteers, local government workers and academics, to representatives from business, charity and national public bodies. So my colleague Christopher and I, we analysed the responses, we identified some areas of consensus, and in the final manifesto we present 10 key policy recommendations for the next Scottish Government to consider. The 2021 manifesto launched last month. We circulated a copy to participants in advance of this event, but I'll ask Christopher just to put a link in the chat window just now in case anyone didn't have time to see it and wants to have a quick look. The main areas in which SURF members would like to see change, they concern the relationships between land use, transport, climate change and place. On page 4 of the manifesto, Christopher's just posted the link there. If you want to look at page 4, you'll see a 1 or 2 sentence summary on each of the 10 recommendations if you want to quickly see what they are. I won't go through them all just now, but I'll just highlight 3 to give a flavour of the content. So first of all, the SURF network's really keen to see a wider approach to retrofitting. This came through really strongly as a measure that greatly helps disadvantaged people and places by improving energy efficiency, as well as housing quality, health and well-being, reducing fuel poverty, and contributing to climate change targets. We heard that the evidence base for retrofitting investments is really strong, especially as many other areas of regeneration investment have a mixed or a negative evidence base or a lack of data. And SURF members in particular sectors felt while some retrofitting programs are happening, working well, they should be scaled up and widened in terms of flexibility. Second point is that the current national regeneration strategy for Scotland is now 10 years old, and many of our consultees felt this was a really good time to simplify the complex policy landscape and respond to the COVID-19 context by consulting towards and developing a new regeneration strategy. It was reported to us that there are a growing number of policies, strategies and principles that a typical regeneration practitioner is expected to respond to, while the resources available to them are staying the same or are even reducing. And finally, the decline in bus services was a big concern for SURF members across many of our consultation themes. As fewer people are using buses, services are being withdrawn, deprived and disconnected areas are struggling in particular, especially where the commercial market is weak and subsidies are making many routes less viable. they're all being left more isolated, and the end result is that people without cars have fewer opportunities. Our network is aware of the reasons for the decline and the additional challenges that COVID-19 will bring, but many felt some urgent action needs to be taken to restore the connective fabric that's being lost. So as I said, the manifesto launched last month with a really good response from our network, and we're pleased that the 5 political parties here today have sent senior representatives. We're hoping that SURF's recommendations will be progressed into further actions in the next term of the Scottish Parliament, and look forward to hearing what our guests have to say today. So thank you very much. I'll pass back to Brian to get started.
Okay, Derek, thanks very much for that useful introduction to SURF's Scottish election question time. What we're going to do now is move to 5-minute presentations by each of the politicians. We're going to call the politicians in alphabetical order, which seemed to us to be the kind of fairest way of doing things. So the whole today will be recorded. We're recording this, so we'll be able to get some notes out to you later on at the conclusion of the meeting. So hopefully everybody's happy with that. We'll try and stick to we will stick to the 5 minutes input from each of our politicians, and then we'll move to as much time as we can for questions from the room. We think we've got about 60 to 70 folk on this. As I said at the beginning, it's difficult to gauge in this way exactly how it will pan out, but we think there's about 60 or 70 folk here. So with that said, we'll move on to Sarah Boyack speaking on behalf of Scottish Labour. Sarah, are you there? Thank you.
Right, it's great to join so many of you this afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation to join you. I very much enjoyed reading your suggested manifesto for the Scottish Parliament, and I have to say I found it quite easy to tick the box on most of them. And it's kind of interesting because there's clearly been a parallel discussion, because we were doing our work on our policy proposals for our manifesto, which there's a health warning. Ours isn't launched yet. It was going to be launched at the start of the week, but because of the cessation of political campaigning, ours is coming out next week. So I can talk about the key principles. But the thing that struck me was that it's about using the resources we've got, and it's about remobilizing our society. It's about creating jobs. It's about tackling the inequalities that have really worsened during the pandemic, and how we reinvest in our communities and our towns and get the kind of housing that we need across the country, and getting the transport system fit for the 21st century, and doing all of that while at the same time we're tackling our climate emergency. I think that's got to be the feature for the next Scottish Parliament. We had a debate at the end of the Parliament where 4 of the committees basically said not enough happening on the climate change agenda, and came up with some really good specific proposals. So I want to focus on what we could do with the next 5 years. I think it's got to be about a COVID recovery Parliament, because we haven't seen the fallout of jobs yet. We've seen lots of women losing their jobs or leaving work to look after their relatives and their loved ones. We've seen the impact on hospitality in my own region in Edinburgh and the Lothians, massive impact. And we know that some of those companies have gone under. Others are using the capacity to keep people furloughed, but there's going to be a huge uncertainty. And we've got the fact that there were people unemployed before the pandemic started. So we have been launching our jobs recovery plans, and we think it's about using the public procurement investment the Scottish Government has got, that £13 billion, to say we will not have 0 hours contracts. We will make sure that people get paid decent salaries, and we'll make sure that there are training opportunities for people. And we need a pipeline of public sector investment, and I'll come on to what that means in practice. We want to make sure that when we're investing and when we have contracts, whether it's the Scottish Government or working with local government, that we tackle the problems we've had with intermittent work and low pay and poverty, but we also tackle our climate emergency. So we want all companies that are bidding for contracts to have to actually demonstrate how they have eliminated their climate emissions, or they are working towards doing that. The other thing we want to do is to focus on town centres, and the regeneration of our town centres is absolutely critical to people, to our society, and to tackling climate change. And if you think about the shift in retail we've had in the last year, somebody summed it up quite neatly. It's been a shift that would have taken 10 years, and it's happened in 12 months. And some of our town centres and cities were already vulnerable, but you can see the big change that's happening. So the ideas in your manifesto about tackling empty homes, about making sure that we regenerate our town centres, which is potentially supporting retail, but is also supporting housing going back into our town centres and making sure we don't have vacancies, and not just using compulsory sale orders, but compulsory purchase orders, and empowering local authorities and communities to act. I was at an event last night where the human impact of the pandemic really came through. It was our local trade union meeting in Edinburgh, and we talked a lot about how we get people's jobs. And one of the things we have focused on is the thousands of jobs that would come from retrofitting our homes, tackling fuel poverty, as you said at the start, but also getting the low carbon infrastructure we need and creating a pipeline of jobs and opportunities. We want to do that in our homes, but we want to do it as well with our renewable sector. And there's a big missed opportunity. We're about to see huge investment in renewables, but not the Scottish jobs chain. So we want to link those two together. And then the other thing I wanted to focus on in my 5 minutes was transport. If we're looking towards the 20-minute neighbourhoods we're all talking about, public transport's critical. And in the last decade, people using buses has dropped dramatically, but so have the availability of buses. So what we want to do, and we amended the last Transport Act to enable this to happen, we want our local authorities to be able to have the kind of bus service we have in Edinburgh and the Lothians. Lothian Buses is owned by our councils. It provides affordable fares, and we'd like to give all young people under 25 free buses to follow on from the free bus travel I introduced when I was minister back in the day in 99. So I think there's so much we can do. We're very keen to work with you, and the manifesto you've got is a fantastic place for the next Scottish Parliament to start. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you very much indeed for that. We'll move swiftly on to Maurice Golden, who's representing the Scottish Conservatives. And again, thank you very much, Maurice, for being with us this afternoon. Have we got Maurice, Emma?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, I can't see you, but please start if you're there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. And I think the manifesto that Surf's created is wonderful, and it was a great reading through it. Lots that I think everyone can agree on, and that's something that's very positive. The Scottish Conservatives believe that every part of Scotland and every community should be backed to succeed. We believe that decisions are best made as close as possible to the people who are affected by them, and that choice and variation of approach between communities is a national strength, not a weakness. However, we have seen centralisation and uniformity prioritised over localism. This centralisation agenda has resulted in many communities across our nation being left behind and suffering from underinvestment. So we understand the link between strong local economies, good council services, and a vibrant community, and we'll respect local decision making and ensure that local services get the funding they deserve. We'll stand up for the interests of all parts of Scotland and support every village, town, and city to rebuild by fairly funding our local services and empowering councils. Our councils, as you know, are responsible for maintaining our roads, educating our children, disposing of our waste, and maintaining public buildings and leisure facilities. They are an essential component of government, and we need to ensure that local solutions are delivered for local problems. From 2007 to 2019, the Scottish Government's budget increased at more than double the rate of the grant they gave to councils. While Barnett formula ensures that the Scottish Government budget is linked to UK government spending, there is no such protection for local government and the services they run. That is why we would bring forward a communities bill to ensure fair funding for our councils. This would introduce a new financial framework that ensures councils automatically receive a set percentage of the Scottish Government budget each year, mirroring the relationship between the Scottish Government and the UK Government. And this would prevent the Scottish Government from underfunding councils and local services by failing to pass on increases in its own budget. and we would ensure that councils have full control over the funding they receive through this framework. We'd also like to amend planning laws so that the Scottish Government cannot overturn a local planning decision. This would ensure that major developments require engagement with communities and that national infrastructure needs to deliver clear local benefits. We also believe that where you live should not limit your opportunities. Everyone deserves to be able to get a good job without having to leave the community that they grew up in or have built their life in. That's why we would deliver a programme of community investment deals to create good local jobs. Now, in terms of housing, we would deliver 60,000 new affordable homes, with 2/3 of these being for new social housing. We would also aim to increase overall house building across all sectors to 25,000 per year by the end of the Parliament. And to support buildings and renovations in remote and rural parts of Scotland, we'd create a rural housing fund. Interlinked with all of this is both a commitment and a delivery plan to tackle climate change. New homes will be energy efficient and will improve the energy efficiency of our current housing stock. We would also introduce a circular economy bill to support communities, and this will include public procurement reform, creating new green jobs, and supporting our third sector. Thank you.
Maurice, thank you very much. That was very concise and to the point. So thank you for that. We'll get some questions on for you later, I'm sure. Okay, moving on then and keeping things rolling forwards, we'll move on to Patrick Harvey for the Scottish Greens.
Hi, how are you doing? And thanks very much for inviting me to take part in today's discussion. I was going to say some very nice things about the SURF manifesto as well. And it seems like that's a theme. Everybody's starting. I don't know if anybody in the audience has ever been to a Burns night where politicians are the guest speakers, but every political party claims Burns as their own and can see something that supports their own political position. You've clearly written the SURF manifesto with the same flexibility because every political party is seeing something that they recognise. I certainly recognise a lot of what's in the SURF manifesto from the Scottish Greens proposition for this election. And just as you were saying, Brian, at the start, that having a hustings like this, we're not all in the same room. It doesn't have the same advantages that we're used to in these kind of discussions, but it's also a really good opportunity to discuss the challenges and opportunities ahead of us. I kind of feel the same way about this election, about this moment that we're at. Nobody would want Scotland to be facing the incredible challenges and the stress, the strain, the grief and the hurt that this last year has posed to us all, and the challenges for our economy through it. But as well as a difficult year, this moment in time also opens up huge possibilities. Pretty much every political party, in fact, pretty much every country is agreeing there needs to be an investment-led recovery. That means substantially increasing the capital side of investment, certainly, but also looking anew, looking afresh at how we're going to fund our public services. It's an opportunity, therefore, to do some of the stuff that has been long waiting to be done, but also to think afresh and to reinvent. The Greens are clear that the priorities for that investment-led recovery has to be around renewables, around warm homes, public transport, and restoring nature. Our climate emergency, and I'm really pleased to see that the SURF manifesto places a strong emphasis on this, is mirrored also by an emergency in nature, the collapse of our natural world. The living world around us is under incredible threat. We've got the opportunity to restore nature in a way that creates long-lasting, sustainable, high-quality jobs as well in many parts of Scotland. Communities large and small, urban and rural, can benefit from that. But so do all those other themes: public transport, warm homes, and renewable energy. These are the ways that we will create the sustainable economy of the future in the age after oil. And we need to be in no doubt that the age of oil is ending. It needs to end. It should have ended already. And if we don't end it quickly, it will end us. So we need to be realistic about the end of the age of oil and the need to create new, lasting economic activity that will benefit people, that will create genuine prosperity at a local level, rather than creating wealth that will be hoarded by another generation of tax exiles. That's the economy of the past, and we can't afford for it to be the economy of the future. I want to say something about physical spaces as well, because one of the big challenges, we've had consultation and development and people feeding in advance to the next national planning framework, for example. We're now going to have to turn a lot of that thinking on its head. We're now going to have to think again about how we use space in our towns and cities. As more people work from home, more employers will recognise that a lot of their objections to home working have been melting away. Many people will work in a hybrid fashion, working from home for part of the time. That's going to change how we use buildings and public spaces in our towns and cities. That's an incredible challenge, but it's also an opportunity to think afresh. There's a danger in doing that too fast. You might see both public space and buildings being allocated for uses that are inappropriate if we do it too fast. My view is the bigger danger is doing it too slow and allowing, for example, buildings that are underused to deteriorate physically if they're not being used, but also to drag down the wider community and to create deterioration in the broader social and economic sense around them. So I think there need to be clear incentives, particularly in the taxation of underused buildings and land, to make sure that there are incentives to bring them back into productive use and to think again about how we live in our towns and cities rather than just thinking of them as commercial spaces. I know I'm coming to the end of the 5 minutes allocated. I hope there's going to be lots of questions because there's so much in this subject to get into. There's no way to touch on it all in an introduction like this. But thanks very much, and I look forward to the questions.
No, thank you for the introduction. And I think we will come back to some of these issues, particularly the one around about dragging areas down, because I maybe pick up on that myself. Okay, keeping the pace up and keeping moving forward, we'll move on now to Paul McGarry, who's here on behalf of the Liberal Democrats. Paul, are you with us?
Yeah, I am. Hi.
Great.
Might see me in the big orange box.
You know.
Be a bit clearer. So thank you for having me today. I am the housing spokesperson for the Scottish Lib Dems, and I'm also the vice chair of the Lib Dems. I was delighted to be invited, as I've been familiar with your work and the projects you're engaged with throughout Scotland. Although, as a boy from north coast of Cornwall, when I receive an invitation with the title Surf, my mind goes to something entirely different. But let me talk a bit about your work and what our party seeks to do. When I took over the brief as housing spokesperson, I did so with a passionate interest in housing and communities as the very core of some of the most important issues affecting the next parliament. Mental health, physical health, education, employment, all really important in the next parliament, cornerstones of our recovery, and each can be substantially improved or made worse by housing. If we invest in community and we invest in housing, we can achieve our goals faster. And communities is a really large part of that. And anyone familiar with any of my campaigns in the past will know that it's a bit of an obsession of mine, particularly as we look at building houses and the endless growth of houses rather than building communities. So here is where I find myself in slightly tricky ground, as some of the others have alluded to. And we talk about our manifesto. It's launched tomorrow. So I can say that I can think members of this forum will be very pleased with what they see. And our manifesto is aligned very closely to yours. And a lot of the ambitions that I had when I came to the brief. There are some places where I think we perhaps maybe go slightly further or go in a slightly different direction. And I'll touch on some of those just now. So retrofitting is really important, but so is getting it right in the first place. Too many homes are receiving very costly retrofit within a decade of them being built. An example of this is broadband, something felt heavily in our poorest communities. Sometimes we could spend 10 times the cost to retrofit rather than building more accessible and adaptable homes. A further example of that, I don't need to tell anyone here that cable ducts has existed for 80 years, yet their absence in the modern home greatly affects our ability to adapt. We also need to put young people at the front of a green jobs revolution. We need to see increased skills in green technologies. And with this will come new opportunities throughout Scotland, new apprenticeships, and an investment in colleges with a focus on environmental skills. Our proposals on land reform will be comprehensive, and we'll put an emphasis on communities and the use of brownfield land. We'll take this further than your proposals, and we'll move towards a brownfield first policy. I keep being dragged to my own constituency in East Kilbride as we continue to see expansion of the green belt as opposed to using some of that brownfield land that's contained within the town's boundaries. Now, again, I look at Glasgow as well as an example of that. In the next Parliament, I want to see a priority placed on empty homes, but we must also see short-term lets addressed in the same way. We've seen whole developments overtaken by short-term let investments, and that is simply not sustainable. We have plans to take action in our manifesto on both issues. And we have ideas that weren't quite ready for our manifesto launch that we'll explore in the early stages of the next Parliament. We also invest in transport, but also include a focus in planning and development of 20-minute neighbourhoods. I have long campaigned for this and have received little more than lip service from some of the other parties. In my own region, throughout Falkirk, North Lanarkshire, South Lanarkshire, the rush to build homes comes at the expense of building communities, building facilities. The own area in East Kilbride, we've got an entire area of 2,000 homes, no community centre, no school, no shops within the actual community, and it's about a 4-mile journey to the nearest school. This simply isn't what the vision for Scotland should be. We should be moving more towards 20-minute communities, more towards providing community facilities at the very heart. And if we're to truthfully live up to our green ambitions, then this absolutely must be something that's trickled down to our councils, to our policies, to our community growth areas. I will have a laser sharp focus to tackling this, and our party is determined to put recovery first above all else in the next Parliament. Thank you very much again for having me.
Thank you. I enjoyed your reference to SURF. The reason that we're called SURF is we used to be the Scottish Urban Regeneration Forum, but we changed that many years ago to be the Scottish Regeneration Forum, but we couldn't quite give up and been on the SURF board, so we're stuck with SURF. But thank you for that. Thank you for your contribution. Finally, and by no means last but no means least, Kevin Stewart from the Scottish National Party. Kevin, are you there with us?
I am indeed, Brian. And,
thank you.
Thank you for inviting me today. I know that you invited the First Minister, but she's getting her jag this afternoon, and you can't miss that. That's for sure. But thank you for inviting me. And first of all, I'd like to pay tribute to Andy Milne, your former Chief Executive. I've not had the chance to do that publicly before, but Andy was a great help to me in my ministerial role. And I know that he did his level best for communities right across Scotland. And he dragged me to a few places at the very beginning of my ministerial job, I think whether I wanted to or not. But I'm very grateful to Andy for all of his efforts, and I wish him all of the very best in his retirement. People have talked around about the last year, and the last year has shown us a number of things. It has shown us that there are stark inequalities out there, and it has shown us that many of our communities are extremely resilient, and that communities themselves are often best placed to deal with the difficulties that they face. And as a former chair of a social inclusion partnership, one of the things which used to annoy me was when things were done to our communities rather than folk listening to the voices within those communities and doing what was right for them rather than what they thought was right. And we've moved on from there, but we still have further to go on that journey, in my opinion. We have seen over the past number of years more powers flow to communities. The Community Empowerment Act did a great deal in terms of asset transfers in terms of participation requests and put power in the hands of local people. But we need to go further. And that's why we will review the Community Empowerment Act if we are re-elected, to build on its strengths and to continue to ensure that power rests with people. We will also bring forward a Community Wealth Building Act, because we know that far too often wealth flows from poorer communities, and we need to do more to ensure that the pounds are kept in those communities. One of the things which we have done as a government is put major emphasis on housing. We've delivered nearly 100,000 affordable homes since 2007. And in our manifesto, we commit to delivering another 100,000 affordable homes between now and 2032. We also, of course, need to ensure that our existing housing is brought up to the standards that are required. And that's why we will have a set housing standard in legislation in early course during the course of the next Parliament if we're re-elected. And we have to, of course, take cognizance of the climate emergency. And I'm very pleased that the SURF manifesto takes cognizance of that. Now we have a balance there's a balance to be struck here in terms of all aspects of meeting our climate targets. And one of the key things that we have got to ensure is that in reaching those targets, we do not put more folk into fuel poverty. And that's why the investment that we make, and we've allocated £1.6 billion over the next wee while to deal with some of this. That's why we must ensure that the jobs that we create are jobs for folks in local communities. When I first got this job, somebody said to me that I should remove an amount of money from Orkney from their HEAPS AB scheme because they hadn't spent the money. But the reality was that they hadn't built up the skills within the islands to carry out the work. They did that and got on with it. And what we need to do, and I'm glad that your manifesto points this out, is to ensure that the jobs go to young folk with the right skills in place. And that's why in our manifesto, we have set aside £500 million to support new jobs and reskill people, which is a requirement if we want to get this absolutely right for communities right across Scotland.
That's great, Kevin. Thank you very much. I'm sorry to interrupt. We're trying to stick to time so we can get more time for the
fair play
audience questions. But thank you very much indeed, and thank you to all of the 5 politicians for being concise and helping us keep to time. My colleague Emma will now explain the process by which we'll get questions. I'm not technically competent to do that, so I rely on Emma to work through the protocol issues. Emma, where are you?
I'm here. So if you look to the bottom kind of tab bar along the bottom of your screen, there's a wee button called Reactions. If you go in there, you can raise your hand, which then flags up to me as a wee blue hand at the side of the screen. Alternatively, you can do as David Somerville has done, and you can type a question into the chat bar at the side. Either way, we will come to you and we'll ask you to unmute, mute and switch your camera on, and then you can ask your question yourself to the parties.
Okay, thanks, Emma. The only thing that I'd add to what Emma said is that if folk could be, out of respect to the politicians, as concise as they were and ask questions in that kind of way, that would be a great help. So the first question we've got is from David Somerville. David, can you set the tone by being as concise as you can, please? If you unmute yourself, that's David.
I'll do my best. All the parties are promising to build lots of houses. There's the house builders on the one hand with 2,000 houses with nothing else around them, and loneliness, isolation, and so on. And 4 bedrooms, 2 cars in the garage, not much help to a lot of people. The intermediate community-led housing has great opportunities. What role does co-housing as such a thing have in your ideas?
Who wants to pick that up? Patrick.
Thanks very much. Yeah, our manifesto does talk about co-housing and also multi-generational developments as things that we'd like to see more of. I was in the SFHA, the Federation of Housing Associations, Hustings the other day, and I think there's a shelter one later as well. And every time, every election, those kind of hustings turn into bidding wars, and all the parties say, here's my target for how many houses are to be built. Here's my target for how many of them are to be affordable, which is a kind of very stretchy term, or for social rent. And actually, we need to be at least as much talking about what kind of housing and how they come to be built. I want to see much more. One of the reasons I want to see much more decentralization of land ownership and land and community ownership is that, we don't want to be in a situation where the volume house builders just come along with another speculative development saying, how much can we get through on this site, and a community that's going to be massively impacted by that has got nothing they can do about it. I think we should be in a situation where local communities determine their housing need, and that's what determines what's going to be built. At the moment, unlike a lot of other European countries, Scotland and the UK have a situation where it's landowners and it's the volume house builders who determine what kind of housing is going to be built. We should be turning that on its head and saying it's social need that determines what kind of housing is built. And if we want to reduce reliance on formal services as well, we should be investing in public services of every kind. But if we want to reduce reliance on them, we need to be building the kind of communities where people have got the chance to meet their neighbours, where they've got not just decent space, but we need people's working conditions to make sure that they've got the time and the energy and the emotional capacity to have relationships with their neighbours as well. And so, the housing issues and how we live in the housing that we build connects directly to things like people's pay and working conditions and the insecurity of people's lives. So as soon as we start talking about this, it connects to everything else about the way that we live and the way our economy functions and the kind of stresses and strains of modern life. So, yeah, I think a great deal of pushing that power and ownership down the chain and pushing a lot of the power away from the volume house builders, who, frankly, we ultimately don't need in the long run if local communities were able to determine their own needs and provide for them.
Okay, thank you. Any other politicians want to pick up now? I've got Kevin first and then Paul.
Thank you very much, Brian. And I would say to David that co-housing very definitely has a role to play in the future. And I think one of the things which we need to look at in terms of learning from the pandemic is those communities where there is already intergenerational living, their ability to cope during the pandemic was much better in many others. And I think that what we need to do as we move forward is to meet the needs of local communities when it comes to housing. Some of the best places that we have created in the past few years have been places where there has been a huge amount of community input into the development of the housing and that place. And it can transform neighbourhoods and regenerate places very, very quickly. A prime example from my own travels out and about is in Alexandria in Dumbartonshire, where housing was put in the town centre on a derelict brownfield site, which had been a dairy which had sat derelict for 15 years. Not only did that create new housing, housing that people themselves had a say in designing, it also regenerated that town centre and made it thrive again. Now, these are the kind of things that have been going on. We need to get even better in terms of not just house building, but placemaking. And I think, you know, we do have that opportunity in terms of National Planning Framework 4 and the review of Scottish planning policy to get that absolutely spot on right. And the more folk that get engaged in that, the better, as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you, Paul, and then we'll move on to the next question.
Thank you. I think I saw Sarah's hand fly up. I don't know how it's organised for you.
Okay.
Perhaps maybe if the politicians stick their hands up, it might make it easier. I don't know. But anyway, what I would like to say, David, I hope that this comes with an invitation after this election to come and see your project, because I'd like to see more about the project and some of the challenges you had. You probably gathered from my early introduction that this is something I'm very keenly interested in. And I think, you know, particularly as we look post-COVID and as organizations and companies and businesses are changing their model, that there's going to be a lot of brownfield land, a lot of commercial land that's no longer being utilized in the same way. And I think with that comes opportunity. And I think co-housing projects are definitely projects that can actually come into that space and make best use of that space. And I think that's the key, because actually co-housing projects, the projects that I'm aware of have certainly come and been born out of good fortune. They've managed to identify a particular piece of land. They've managed to get that particular piece of land. And, you know, and sometimes it's their fifth or sixth attempt to find a suitable base in order to create this. That shouldn't be the case. So we should actually be working more with local authorities in order to create those opportunities and to identify opportunities and to advertise opportunities where there is a suitable use of that land. They're certainly not very far away from where I am. There was a suitable opportunity for exactly a co-housing project, but in the end, it took so long that the land became dilapidated and it no longer is suitable for the purpose. It is a part of our manifesto tomorrow. We will be discussing how we can make that more possible, how we can force a sale of derelict sites and to bring them into use. But with that will come a part of working with the local authorities in order to bring them along this journey. You know, as a party of localization, we wouldn't suppose to impose on the local authorities, but we certainly should be moving forwards on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Sarah and June, Morris want to say anything? Morris has his hand up. Sarah, you want to say something?
Yeah, just briefly. Thanks very much, Brian. I actually spent a couple of years working for housing associations and co-ops in Scotland. What it really brought home to me was the huge social benefit of people actually having a say over how their houses are managed, how their community is managed. So we need more of that. I would add, in addition to the co-housing formula, I think we need to learn from the experience that David's talked about, and we did discuss it at our last cross-party group on housing, that we had a very good discussion in the Parliament recently. But I think there's also things like student housing as well, and the city I live in is now completely dominated by very expensive private student accommodation, and it's not affordable for students, but it also doesn't engage them, doesn't give them any control or power whatsoever. So I think opening up that opportunity is really important to young people. And the other thing is, there's been a bit of discussion about the 20-minute neighbourhood. We need to make it a reality, because even in Edinburgh, where we've got a fantastic bus company, we've got lots of evidence of major new residential developments being built on greenfield sites that don't have bus connectivity. They're nowhere near a railway station, and they don't have walking or cycling routes. So there's something about joining all this up together is absolutely critical, not just with new build, but also retrofitting. When we're thinking about retrofitting, also think about the communities, not just the individual buildings. Thanks, Brian.
Okay, thank you. Morris, you want to make some comments?
Thank you. Yes, I think the co-housing model fits very well with our community investment deals that we're going to be announcing next week. I can't give you the exact figure until our manifesto's launched, but I think that would work well. But as some contributors have mentioned, it's not just about building homes, it's not just about building energy efficient homes, it's all the associated infrastructure that we need along with that. You know, solar panels, heat pumps, ensuring there's electric car charging points. Infrastructure in terms of transportation must include cycling routes and walking routes, as well as access for things like a local school, community hub. And I think we need to get far better at that model where people do have access to facilities and effectively, instead of create homes, create communities.
Thanks very much. A good round of questions and answers about some of the housing issues. I wonder if I could maybe exercise the chair's prerogative and move us off housing onto something else. A question from Ian Manson, which is about health inequalities in our most deprived places. Ian, where are you? Ian?
Hello.
Hi.
I'm here. Can you see and hear me?
I can see you fine. You on you go with your question.
Hello, everyone. Thanks to SURF for a great event and a great manifesto, and to the politicians for their time, a most pressing time for them. I was listening carefully to the parties who mentioned place and a focus on place, because I think the essence of SURF is about deprived areas and doing something about that. And it was good to hear Conservatives mention community investment funds, Liberal Democrats talk about 20-minute neighbourhoods, and SNP talk about communities and community wealth building. So there's lots of positives in there, but we do have some tough choices to make when it comes to places and resources. And we have some of the worst health inequalities in Western Europe and some of our most deprived places. The pandemic has had a health impact, and the death rate has been higher in our most deprived areas. But the good news is we also have place and community as our top priority when it comes to our public health strategy. It's about how we make that real now post-pandemic, and how we focus resources and really make an impact on health in our most deprived places. And it'd be great to hear the party's ideas on that.
Thanks, Ian. Okay, who wants to start with that? I can't see all the hands, so if one of our politicians, Kevin's up first. Go Kevin. Kevin, yeah.
Thank you, Brian. I should probably stop volunteering to go first all of the time. I think one of the key things in all of this, Ian, is around about what I was saying earlier, around about listening to local communities and what they actually need and require, rather than necessarily imposition. Now, today we heard the First Minister talk about shifting the balance of health spending, increased health spending into primary and community works. Now, I'm sitting in Middlefield in Aberdeen, which is a regeneration community. And one of the real differences that was made in this community was the establishment of Middlefield Health Project, which was called the Healthy House, which some folk will have heard of. And one of the key things that happened there was that NHS Grampian, instead of imposing what it thought was required, actually began to listen to folk, and changes were made in terms of the support that was in play there. So obviously at that point, NHS Grampian had major emphasis on reducing heart disease and cancers, as always the case. But the community at that point said, we want much more resources in terms of mental health support. And I think we have to listen to people. We have to be brave in terms of allowing folk a say in what services are required to reduce those health inequalities. And we have to keep our lugs open to their suggestions, because they are often the ones who are absolutely spot on right around about how you change that direction of travel. Now, I know that Ian does that at Clyde Gateway, and that many others do likewise, but there needs to be much more listening to meet the needs of local communities.
Thank you. Sarah. You're muted, Sarah. That's better, Sarah.
Thanks. The health inequalities have to be a key issue for this next Parliament, because there's a 20 to 30 year difference in life chances depending on your income. And we've got some communities where people die early basically because they've been born and they've grown up poor and their lives haven't changed. So I think from our schools, in terms of the educational attainment gap, preventative health, to focus on keeping people well, not just curing them, has to be critical. And it's now a decade since the Campbell Christie review, which came up with fantastic recommendations yet to be implemented. So I think focusing on how we reduce poverty, which we've talked about more affordable housing, but there's something about access to jobs and training. And that's why I think we should be competing for you. We should be competing to say who's got the best plans. And if we think about retrofitting housing and linking it into training opportunities, that is a key way to begin to give people opportunities. Because if you think of some of our most unequal communities, there are huge amounts of work that need to be done in them. But it's giving people the training and the life chances and the jobs, and not just short-term contracts on poor pay. So the real living wage, using our public sector contracts, there is so much more we can do to turn around people's life chances. And where they live is part of that. Improving those areas has to be part of that as well. And that's why, you know, if we were to follow our approach of eradicating our household fuel poverty by retrofitting all of our homes over the next decade, you've got the job creation, you've got the climate impact, you've got the tackling fuel poverty. That is, to me, that is the place to start, because that would make the real difference that people need. And it also lets you reuse existing buildings and make them fit for purpose. So the solutions are there. We just need the political priority to put the investment in to make it happen. Thank you.
Okay, do any of other politicians want to come in? Maurice has his hand up, then Paul. Maurice first, then Paul.
Thank you. I mean, there's a lot of issues intertwined in health inequality. The top line is it's far too high, and that's completely unacceptable, that people, because of where they're born, have severely limited life chances. I previously worked at one way of attempting to tackle health inequalities by improving access to healthier food, as well as the skills to be able to utilize food and cook soup and pasta and healthy and cheap meals. But we need to do far more on that front as well. I think another aspect is access to community leisure facilities, going back to our earlier point, and making sure that our schools and existing public buildings are opened up to communities. We also need to have our mental health services being delivered at a community level as well, particularly with the pandemic. I think we are increasingly seeing a crisis in mental health and welfare, and we need to deliver that at a local level. And the final point on this is that our drug death rates are a national scandal. My hometown of Dundee is the drug death capital of Europe. That is a complete embarrassment, and we must ensure we've got some investment, perhaps too little, too late, but the next priority within the Parliament must be tackling those drug deaths, increasing the amount of rehabilitation beds that are available. And if we did some of those things, then we will begin to tackle health inequalities, but there's probably a lot more we could go into on that front.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a very broad subject, and it covers so much. I mean, I think some of the issues that I'd focus on is, without going straight back into housing, is, you know, housing being a very important part of that, and a very important part of creating the healthy environment. We've seen houses that are just well below standard, have dampness, other issues, and it affects a young person's health. We need to be looking at certainly early intervention when it comes to diet, and I think some of the stuff that we're moving towards in terms of providing free school meals to children, particularly those from poorer backgrounds, is starting to improve a lot better than it was at the beginning of the last Parliament. But it's certainly a journey that I think we need to continue on. And mental health is another issue. When you have a look at the CAMH statistics for young people, I think it's about 1,500 young people at the moment waiting longer than a year to receive mental health services. And if you have a look at the regions and the authorities that are most affected by that, it is the poorer communities that are waiting the longest, that are being left behind the furthest. And I think this needs to be addressed in the same way that we look at education and education interventions that focus on our poorer communities. But I think we also equally need to put some form of premium in order to address health in those communities, and also reversing some of the centralization of services that we've seen, local out-of-hours GP services in the poorest communities being moved out of those communities and moved to wealthier communities. When it's actually the wealthier communities who are most able to access those facilities if they are further away. It's the poorest communities actually have the least ability to access services if they are an extra 5, 6, 7 miles away from where they live. There's a lot covered there, but I hope that helps.
No, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. Patrick, will you want to say something about health inequalities?
Yeah, and I don't want to pour cold water on a lot of the stuff that's been said, because obviously, yes, we need to be looking at how to make health services more accessible in local communities. We need to be looking, in particular, as Maura says, about the drugs death scandal. We need to be looking at, fuel poverty, as Sarah said, and some of the more substantial budget amendments the Greens have won in recent years has been about investing more in energy efficiency. But really, I think we need to stop kidding ourselves that something like health inequality can be addressed through health policy, just as we need to stop kidding ourselves that the poverty-related educational attainment gap can be fixed by schools. We have an incredibly unequal economy. That's the root of the problem. And, it's not good enough for folk who are on, good jobs and secure incomes and secure housing to be trying to talk about, can we not just give poor people cheap food? Give them more access to cheap food? No, we need to be recognizing that wealth and income has to be redistributed in our society. We currently tolerate the idea that people at the top end of the income scale can be demanding tax cuts, and from the UK government getting tax cuts at the top end of the income scale, while even what is laughingly described as a national living wage is not a living wage, is a poverty wage, and not even everybody gets it. Not even everybody on the minimum wage gets it, because the lower age bands get paid substantially less. We need to be not tolerating the idea that huge amounts of the wealth generated by all of us in our economy are hoarded by an ever declining number of people, and by businesses that stash it all in tax havens. We need to, if I can use a horribly bastardized phrase, take back control of our economy from those who have been hoarding control and hoarding the wealth that the rest of us generate. So unless we address that fundamental economic injustice in our society of maldistribution of wealth and incomes, we're going to be still talking about health inequalities and educational attainment gap and all of the rest of it, year after year, election after election, generation after generation.
Okay, Patrick, thank you very much for that. Okay, I'm moving on to a question from Alistair Moody, which has caught my eye, because Alistair says that the SUF manifesto seemed very weak on local government and planning. So just to prove we're not biased towards ourselves, Alistair, could you put your question, please?
Right, thank you. I want to know how the imbalance of power between central government and local government will be addressed. I heard only Maurice Golden mention a proposal for reform. What do the other parties propose? It seems to me that also planning is a very undemocratic process, in my experience, where local communities' concerns are just overruled by the reporters of the power of the Scottish ministers, and they're above question. I've seen them take quite arbitrary decisions because it suited the developers whose appeal was upheld. So there is this huge imbalance between the centre and the local communities. The Community Empowerment Act is a bit of a joke, actually, because it avoids the key issues around who has the power and how it's exercised.
Thank you, Alistair. Maurice, you were mentioned in dispatches there, so we'll come to you first.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that the planning system, despite us passing a planning act in Parliament, is still not fit for purpose. And ultimately, what I believe is that we shouldn't allow the Scottish Government to overturn the wishes of local communities. So we should have communities at the heart of our planning process, and we shouldn't allow a situation where just because a major developer has the funding and the time to be able to push a community into a major development when the community is against that. I think we need to protect our green spaces in many of what is effectively overdeveloped towns and urban areas throughout Scotland. And that means ensuring that the Scottish Government cannot overturn the wishes of communities.
Great, thank you very much for that. Patrick, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this goes back a very, very long way. You know, before the modern planning system, you owned a piece of land, you could basically do what you wanted with it. The planning system was supposed to create some level of democratic accountability, because when people make decisions about how land is going to be developed, it doesn't only impact on the owner, it impacts on the whole community. So there's supposed to be some democratic accountability. And what we have now, many years later, is a system that is barely even quasi-democratic. The local community could choose in a local election to sack their councillors and elect new councillors whose sole manifesto promise is, I'm going to oppose this development. And if they do that, those councillors can't even take part in the decision because they're kind of seen to be biased. So there's no democratic role, really. There's always going to have to be some relationship between central and local government. It needs to not be an overbearing one. But the group that are overrepresented and overpowerful in the planning system are not actually central government. It's developers, it's private interests, and you know, looking at equal appeal rights would be one way of doing that. That's long overdue. But also the time and the money that communities need to put in to just fight their corner is absurd. The last thing I wanted to say on this, because it was about local government as well. I think, you know, the Greens have made serious efforts to try and propose a fiscal framework for local government. I think Maurice knows that the idea that you just have a fixed percentage of the national budget allocated to local government is silly. You know, suddenly a pandemic comes along and you've got to spend massively on health. Well, you know, a fixed percentage for local government wouldn't have worked in the last couple of years because of what's been needed. So it needs to be a more sophisticated arrangement than just a fixed percentage. But there does need to be a fiscal framework. But every time the Greens have managed to take little steps toward local fiscal autonomy by creating local tax powers that councils can use themselves, you have other opposition parties throwing their hands in the air, saying this will destroy our tourism industry, or this is a war on motorists. You know, so if we're serious about giving local fiscal powers to local government, and preferably, you know, down further, because what we call local government isn't really very local in this country, then we also need political parties to have the courage of saying, if local councils do something I don't like with it, that's their choice, not mine. So if we're serious about local empowerment, it means national political parties have to accept that sometimes local councils will do things that we didn't want them to do.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. Sarah.
Thanks. Yeah, I think there's 2 points I want to make. The first is about funding for local government. And I think it's got worse in the last few years because we've had a more centralised approach by government, and local government simply hasn't been given enough funding. And if you look at issues where it affects our community investment, our local roads and transport infrastructure, you can see councils are absolutely cash strapped. And we haven't seen the change to the council tax that I think was an SNP promise in 2014, but Scottish Labour was quite happy to work with the other parties and talk about what we could agree with. So for me, that's got to be unfinished business in the next Scottish Parliament, and proper funding from the Scottish Government. But the other thing is new powers that I think local authorities should have. And in the last few weeks of the Parliament, we passed the Andy Whiteman bill, which was about the European Charter for Local Government. And I hope that's going to shift the dial in terms of the relationship and the respect between central and local government. And I think there's a really strong argument for more powers for local authorities and the capacity to do things like tourism levy. I was working on a members bill on that in 2016 before the last election, looking at land value. So when developments take place, if you look at the stats on land has been one of the most profitable places to put your money over the last few years. And then what happens is when we try and get affordable housing or even private sector housing, the value of the land makes that housing more expensive, and it makes it impossible for local authorities to put in the infrastructure they need. If you look at cities like Edinburgh or Midlothian Council next to me, they cannot afford the investment in critical new community facilities. So that's got to be sorted. And the other thing is the powers that local authorities have. So I'd like them to see not just to have a compulsory purchase order power, but also the compulsory sale order. So if you're in a town centre and you've had vacant and derelict property for years, the council should be able to just require that to be put up for sale and to be able to buy it. They need the money to do that. They need the power to do that. And I think that's been suggested by the Scottish Land Commission. That would be a good proposal. And finally, on planning, I wasn't in the Parliament with the last Planning Act, but I know my Labour colleagues fought really hard to try and get more democracy into the system with amendments, and they didn't get a majority. So there's a lot of unfinished business here, but particularly empowering councils and funding them properly has to be at the heart of enabling our communities to flourish going forward. Thank you.
Cheers. Paul, you want to say something?
Absolutely. I just want to touch on two issues. Sort of a case study, if you like an example. We had in South Lanarkshire a waste incinerator plant that was opposed locally. And the reason it was opposed was because there were a fixed show people site that was literally on the doorstep of this project. And originally the planning had been passed because that wasn't considered a fixed abode of which the restriction for building these type of sites would apply. So quite rightly, there was local opposition to this, including significant SNP politicians such as Richard Lyle leading in terms of this campaign. And it went to the Scottish Government, and Alex Neil overruled the local council. And, you know, this is an example of something that's just quite absurd, that actually it can, without considering all these sort of local issues that are being raised from all sort of parties, not being, and they could just be simply overruled. And the other point I pick on sort of what Patrick Harvey was saying is I find absolutely ridiculous that in the last local authority elections, when I stood on a community facilities rather than just building houses manifesto, that I was told that actually that would probably prohibit me from being in the planning committee because I would have too much conflict of interest. Yet other political parties can receive donations from housing developers, and that's not considered in any way to be a conflict of interest. Yet simply turning around and saying, hang on a second, the fact that we're having huge housing estates without any community facilities is absurd. That would prevent me actually being involved. So I hope that answers your question, Alistair, and gives you a sense of where I'm coming from on this.
Kevin, do you want to come in this?
Yes, please. And I think I'm probably the only one in the panel who has been a local councillor. And I think that gives you some grounding in what actually goes on out there. And I think that, you know, some of the points that have been made are extremely simplistic. And I think Patrick Harvey picked this up in terms of Maurice Golden's certain percentage of money for local government, that is extremely simplistic. And the other thing which has been said is new powers for local government. And I'm not against new powers for local government, far from it. However, I think what we also need to look at is the powers that local government currently do not use. And during the course of the Community Empowerment Act going through committee and the review that we did into the autonomy of local government at the same time, it was quite astounding how many councillors who appeared in front of the local government committee, which I chaired at the time, who did not seem to realise the powers that they had at their disposal. And I think that we have to ensure that we educate folk around about what they can already do in terms of the powers that they have. And let me move on to the planning aspect. And I have to be very careful as planning minister because I cannot talk about any case which may cross my desk at any point, and I don't know what the position will be after the election. But again, the scenario of not having some kind of appeal system would mean that certain things would not happen. If you went with Maurice Golden's argument that the decisions by local authority members could not be overturned, that means that certain things would not happen in Scotland. Now, let me give you an example of cases which have crossed my desk without giving the individual cases. Cases in terms of gypsy traveller sites. There is not a local authority that I can think of in recent times that has passed an application for a gypsy traveller site, and yet we know that we need them. Children's homes, homes for asylum seekers, decisions locally, no, and the only way that some of these things which we need have gone ahead is because it's gone to reporters or to Scottish ministers. And let me give you a case which I can mention because it is done and dusted. But in Hopeman in Murray, Murray Council threw out plans for new social housing in that village. The reporter, based on the housing needs and demands and assessments of the area, and taking into account the local development plan, overturned that decision and allowed those social houses to go ahead. And said in the report that there was a social housing crisis in that area and these homes were necessary. And beyond that, said that those homes were likely required to support and retain local services. These are things that cannot be ignored. Now, I want the process to be more democratic. That's why we put in place local place plans to feed into local development plans. And we need more folk to be involved in the planning system. Because as it stands at the moment, most of the folk who do become involved are older and settled and do not want change. And we know that in many places, in order for those places to thrive and in some cases survive, development needs to take place.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. We'll maybe move on. Thanks very much for that. We've got about 6 minutes left before I ask the politicians to wrap up. So I think we'll get time for one more question. And there's been plenty of questions put up to me, but the questions we've had so far and the answers have been great. So one more question, I think, and that's from Gavin Thompson. Gavin, are you there? Gavin?
I am here, yes. Sorry, I'm so taken aback you chose my question. Thanks very much. So 20-minute neighbourhoods have been mentioned a few times. So this is the idea that you can have neighbourhoods that people can travel to everything they need within 20 minutes, ideally sustainable transport methods, walking or wheeling or cycling. I just wanted to ask people how they thought that could be achieved, particularly given all of the things that have been discussed. So powerful and builders might not want mixed-use developments. A decade of austerity in which a lot of public services have retreated from communities, so how would they be replaced? And also the idea that a deprioritization of car use reduction measures are very often politically toxic, very difficult to deliver. Those are just some of the problems, I think, with 20-minute neighbourhoods, which sound great, and I think every party sort of generally supports, but in practice, how would you deliver it? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go to Maurice first. Maurice, are you there? Maurice?
Yeah, I'm here.
Thank
I mean,
you.
I think the idea is great. I think we can definitely put in measures for our new communities to be based around 20-minute communities. I think the bigger challenge is going to be retrofitting large parts of Scotland that don't have access to local facilities, local schools, local shops, leisure centres, and that is a mammoth task to retrofit large swathes of Scotland. It's not something we should shy away from, but we absolutely have to ensure that whether it's a co-housing proposal or it's a private developer, they must provide that the facilities associated with that. There's a major problem in Dundee at the Western Gateway at the moment, whereby exactly as you've kind of highlighted, Gavin, a major development being built. There's no school, there's no access to get around the town, and it's a major problem. The community's fighting back, attempting to get those facilities in, but it's so difficult. Once that development's done, developers away, you're left holding the baby, as they say, and we absolutely have to change that. And I hope that the next Scottish Government, with support from the Scottish Parliament, can do far more to do that.
Anyone else? Any other politicians? Paul first, then Sarah, then Kevin.
Yeah, it would be no surprise that I am very much on board with creating 20-minute neighbourhoods. And I think the principal thing I'd pick on in this is that actually when we have new community growth areas and when we have new community plans, often these plans have these facilities. In fact, where I live, in the very estate that I live in, if you drive halfway down it, on the left-hand side, you'll see a big green space. That was the school. And if you have a look on the right-hand side, you'll see a nursing home. That was the community centre. And as the plans were being developed, the developers were going through saying, you know, there's been a change in circumstances. Things have changed. We can no longer afford to do this. We can no longer afford to develop this. And, you know, councils cash-strapped have taken the money. And we've seen this. And this is not an isolated incident. We've seen this right across Scotland. Part of that needs to be giving local authorities more money, but also a greater part of that needs to be more transparency in local planning, allowing more visibility. I think in this Zoom age, we can absolutely do this. So that actually politicians are being shown for exactly what they're doing, because it's very easy for every politician to stand at the council campaigns, council election campaigns and say, I agree with you, and they all did. But actually, you know, they then excuse themselves and their party votes through something completely different. And I think we need greater transparency in planning to make sure it happens, because I think what we have at the very early stages of proposals is not a million miles off exactly what we're talking about in 20-minute neighbourhoods, but we need to, you know, really double down on that and make sure that they're delivered.
Okay, great, thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, if I can just make a couple of points. We've talked a bit about inequalities this afternoon, but one of the things in terms of 20-minute neighbourhoods that's not really had the kind of prominence it should have is the issue of women and gender inequalities. And if you look at car ownership, for example, or inequalities in terms of households not being able to afford cars, we still have many households don't have access to a car, they don't own a car, they don't have the money to own a car, and they certainly aren't going to be able to afford an electric vehicle. So one of the things we've talked about in our climate recovery plan is about having grants for electric vehicles for low-income households, but also having more car clubs. And I had a look recently at the Edinburgh City Car Club, and it's really interesting seeing which communities don't get access to the car club. Actually, quite a few low-income communities don't have a car in the area. So there's something about we can't have all journeys are not going to be suitable for public transport, but there is an inequality in access to cars. And the 20-minute neighbourhood is about making things closer to people. So you could be walking, wheeling or cycling, or access to bus. And I think it's, I started out as a town planner admission a million years ago. That was my profession. And actually some of the inequalities we can see in the buildings and the developments we did then are actually writ large today. So I think we also need to have a gender equality issue here, and going back to access to public services like buses are really important. And the other thing is, during the pandemic, it's been really interesting seeing more people walking and cycling. So there's an opportunity to make some of the new the street changes we've seen in terms of extra pavements and extra cycling opportunities, to keep some of them, and also to make sure that you can look at tweaking them to make them more accessible to people. But I think that's one of the things that I think's been good, seeing families out on the streets, families with 2 kids who are really young on bikes. You wouldn't have seen that a year or 2 ago. So there's something about making those routes safer. And if you ask women about using bikes, they are more reluctant because they're worried about their safety. So I just thought we haven't talked about that 50% of the population in the discussion today. So just add it into the mix in terms of thinking about the impact to the built environment. And that's one of the reasons why I'm quite enthusiastic about 20-minute neighbourhoods. I actually think we should have been doing that for years. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks very much. Kevin?
Sorry, forgot to unmute there. I think one of the key things for me in all of this, and many of the folk who are in the call here today are very well versed in community planning, which works well right across the country. And what my ambition was in terms of the Planning Act was to make sure that community planning and spatial planning were intertwined. And that's why local place plans are so important, because getting the views of people is essential in terms of the creation of new places. And we should start off by looking at master planning any new development to ensure that it lives up to what is required, not only for today, but also how adaptable is it for the future. Now, we've seen a huge amount of developments here in recent times where, the place itself is quite fantastic because it has been well thought out in terms of access for all. The green spaces are right, and the public realm is spot on too. Now, much of this is not rocket science, and the way that we can improve on all of this always is to listen to communities themselves in terms of what they want and need in that particular place. And I think that that is entirely achievable. And I think that local place plans, as we move forward, will be absolutely vital in setting the agenda for future local development plans. Finally, if I may, Brian,
sure.
I think, again, my appeal to people would be to get involved in terms of the formulation of National Planning Framework 4 and that review of Scottish planning policy, because your views would be much appreciated in order that we get all of this right.
Okay, thank you very much. Patrick, we'll go to you last. And if you could, in the 20 minutes, be a wee bit brief, and then I'll get all the politicians back in for the final comments. Patrick.
Got you, understood. I'm really interested that everyone is talking in positive terms about this concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods. I have to confess, our manifesto uses the term 15-minute neighbourhoods. I don't think it's a great ideological schism, and maybe we can, compromise on 17.5-minute neighbourhoods. But the place that we kind of ground this is in transport policy, because transport is one of the biggest areas where we're seeing failure at the moment. We've not seen, since the abandonment of road traffic reduction targets many years ago, we've seen increasing emissions not just decreasing too slowly, but increasing emissions from transport. And we have a transport system that doesn't meet most people's social need either, because it's expensive to use public transport in most of our country, and in other places it doesn't exist at all. So we want to allocate a minimum of 10% of the transport budget to active travel, and a further 10% to this concept of 15-minute neighbourhoods, so that you've got a substantial pot of funding available. And it's by making that funding available that you can allow people to make local decisions. It does need to be done in a deliberative and a participative way, a little bit like the Spaces for People stuff. In the last year, there's been some really good stuff happening, some really good examples. There are some awful examples as well, where even your local councillors, never mind local communities, don't get to shape the plans, and that creates a kind of backlash against it. The last very quick point is, this is a politically difficult issue, partly because many politicians like to offer people an easier way of having what they're already used to. Let's find a way to make it cheaper and easier for people to drive. Actually, there are some people whose accessibility needs mean that they do need a little bit help to afford a vehicle of their own. But other than that, low car ownership should be a good thing. It should be something that we celebrate, because our public transport system is meeting people's needs and is affordable and reliable. That's where the lack is. So let's not waste time trying to give people an easier way to have what they're already used to, when the challenge has to be setting out a picture of how we could meet our needs in a different way, rather than just by having more of the same.
Patrick, thank you very much. We're kind of close to time, but it would be unfair not to allow the politicians at least 2 minutes, I think. So if all the participants can indulge me, we said a minute, but I think if we allow them 2 minutes, that will be fair, to just make any points they want to make towards the end, based either on what their political perspective is going into the election, or on regeneration, or some of the things I've heard this afternoon. So what we're going to do is we're going to start in reverse order from what we did at the beginning. So we'll start with Kevin Stewart at the bottom, and we'll work our way through to Sarah Boyack. So Kevin, 2 minutes, please, if you don't mind.
I'd like to thank you very much for allowing us to take part in this debate today. And I would encourage everyone to read the various manifestos. I think there are a number of key things as we move forward. We need to decarbonise, and we need to ensure that the right level of investment goes in to ensure that we are creating jobs here to allow that to happen. We also require more homes. Everybody says so. And that's why we are committed to 100,000 new homes. And again, I would urge folk to read Housing to 2040, which is the first ever long-term strategy for Scotland. We have done a huge amount in our time in government in terms of empowering communities. The Community Empowerment Act was game-changing, but we can go further and should go further. And that is what we are committed to do in terms of review of the existing Act, but beyond that, looking beyond that in terms of community wealth building. Finally, I'll end on planning, which is probably the most controversial thing, as always. But we need to empower local communities to take part in the planning process. And we need to ensure that our planners have the tools to engage with communities to help them on the journey of formulation of those local place plans.
Thanks very much indeed, Kevin. Paul McGarry.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who's contributed. I've been reading through sort of some of the notes, and if people would like to email me any specific things, it's paul@paulmcgarry.org, that easy. And I'd happily look into some of these. For a lot of the questions being raised here, I wonder if you're all living in the same community that I live in, or actually we're just seeing the same problems across Scotland. I mean, Alistair, you write about the schools, and we have the same issue here, that, you know, since they closed significant numbers of schools and rebuilt them, they've been building houses. And now we have in central Scotland, in both Falkirk, North Lanarkshire, and South Lanarkshire, some of the largest schools in Scotland, overcapacity, bursting, and we're continuing to build new housing developments. We need new thinking. We need to be pushing towards community development. We need to be giving more power to local authorities. We need to be funding local authorities. The bottom line is, above all else, we need to be putting our recovery first, and we need to be doing that by creating a fairer, more equal society. So I passionately believe in. It's one of the few candidates in Scotland from a poorer community myself. You know, I've seen the inequality firsthand, and I understand what it means to be brought up in a poorer community and the disadvantage that it creates for you in the workplace, in education, and even indeed in the political sphere. And it's something I'm committed to changing. Our party's committed to changing it. I hope that you guys will spend 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever it takes, jumping through to the section on housing after our launch in tomorrow's manifesto. I think you'll find an awful lot that's sympathetic to what we've been discussing today and to some of our plans to address some of these issues that you've raised. I won't go on too much longer because I'll go over my time, but thank you very much to everybody. And again, please do contact. Please see me as an open door to discuss these issues. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. Patrick.
Thanks again, Brian. This has been such a grim year. It's been tough, it's been stressful, but a crisis is also an opportunity, and recovery from a crisis is a chance to remake the world better. I think we need to approach COVID recovery with the same courage and the same determination actually that the generation after the Second World War approached recovery from that trauma with. They laid the groundwork for a national health service, for a welfare state, because they fought together, they'd survived together, and they were going to rebuild together. And for decades after that, the UK became a steadily more equal place. We have the same moment of opportunity at this point in history. When you have even tepid centrist politicians like Joe Biden and the EU pushing an investment-led recovery on a scale that is really substantial, we need to not fall behind that. When you have even the IMF, hardly the most progressive economic voices on the planet, saying that wealth taxes have to be used by governments to fund an investment-led recovery, we have an opportunity not just to spend more money on the stuff that we've been talking about today, public transport, housing, energy efficiency, and so on, but we have a chance to shape our society anew and make sure that it's a genuinely equal and greener society and economy. I hope you'll find that the Green Manifesto sets out positive ways of achieving that. I hope you know that the Greens have a track record of achieving that already by pushing the Scottish Government beyond their comfort zone, and I hope you'll vote like our future depends on it. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Patrick. Maurice?
Thank you. I just really wanted to touch on a new area. Michael Cook actually messaged in the chat bar just around the circular economy, and rather than reiterating the points you've already heard me discuss, I thought I'd raise a new one near the end. And the first actually links to Paul's point around incinerators. And in the Scottish Parliament, both the SNP and the Lib Dems are very much in favour of incinerators. In fact, incineration capacity has gone up 400%. That means, to link to Michael's point, that we will soon have targets to recycle an item that has to be burned because we've got a contract with an incinerator. It's a ludicrous situation. And Michael was asking about the focus on recycling. Well, I wish that we were able to move up the waste hierarchy, but unfortunately, we still haven't met our 2013 recycling target. But yes, there's lots more jobs in reuse and remanufacturing. In fact, according to the Scottish Government, they would have 4,700 new jobs created in remanufacturing, creating £620 million, but we haven't seen it. We're failing on climate change, we're failing our communities, and that drastically has to change. We also need to support community groups like the Lochee Community Group. I grew up in Charleston, just down the road, and we need longer funding cycles for our third sector so that they can plan, because otherwise what you get is you get your money in, and then 9 months later, you're thinking of closing down, and then you squeeze everything. We need 3-year funding cycles, supporting our third sector, and also ensuring that we don't talk big on climate change, we actually deliver on it.
Honest, thank you very much. Sarah, it's down to you for the final remarks.
Thanks. Well, it's been a really good set of questions today, and really interesting hearing people's answers. For me, and for Scottish Labour, the next Parliament's got to be all about COVID recovery, whether it's jobs or NHS, housing, our communities, and making sure that we tackle the climate and nature emergencies as part of all of our strategies. So when we're spending money on anything, we think through the carbon emission implications, and we make sure that we reduce our emissions, because the next 5 years are the critical ones. I don't know if anyone else saw this, but I saw a picture this week of the impact of sea level rise in Scotland that is predicted by 2050. And it was seeing a map like that 30 years ago when I was a town planner that actually got me passionate about climate change, and we have not done enough. So the next 5 years, how we use our land, so more land reform, how our housing emissions are targeted, and our transport emissions are targeted. These are 3 key areas where, in terms of our communities and our planning and our investment, that's got to be top of the agenda. I mean, I'm hopeful in that some of the hustings I've been to, there's huge agreement on retrofitting existing housing to tackle fuel poverty, create jobs and reduce our emissions, but it's got to be double the current rate. It's got to be way more ambitious. And I think in terms of transport, we've covered some really good discussions today. I would push on the start with walking, cycling, wheeling, better buses, and making our trains affordable. That's absolutely key for all our developments. And I think the other thing I'm keen to do is to say you get 2 votes. So have a look at your candidates, check them out. One of the things that struck me since I've come back to the Parliament was the number of Labour MSP bills that we've got through: period poverty, tide pubs, shop workers. And I'm delighted to see that the SNP have now adopted a couple of our principles in community wealth building and the Good Food Nation. So there's an opportunity for us to have a radical Parliament where we focus on tackling COVID and creating the jobs and tackling climate emergency. I think there is some agreement across parties. The issue is going to be going below the headlines and actually looking at the real expenditure and making sure that what people say is followed up by what we do. So it's been great to join you all today. And let's hope that if we were to come back in a decade, we have got some 20-minute neighbourhoods. We have got some land reform with housing owned by people where they've actually really been able to shape their communities and their local plans. That would be exciting. Thanks very much, Brian.
Sarah, thank you very much indeed. Can I offer my personal thanks to all 5 of our guests for making my life easy by sticking to time and answering the questions fully, but by being here. And can offer your thanks to them also for the time they've taken to come along and talk to us and to address some of the issues. We're a wee bit over time, but I think it's been fine. SURF will be working with a number of policy development groups and partner organisations across the Parliament and cross-party groups to further promote our manifesto recommendations. So that's what we'll be doing. Can I remind you that the event today has been recorded, so we'll be working with Christopher, one of our colleagues, to draft a short summary of key points, and we'll circulate that to folk. If you've asked a question and you don't want to be named in the report, can you contact one of our SURF colleagues and they'll take care of that for you, if that's what you want. We're going to have a series of free workshops in July to promote learning from last year's SURF Awards. We didn't have an awards dinner last year in the real sense. We had a virtual one, but we still want to promote the activities that led to folk being commended and actually winning SURF Awards. And we're hopeful, whether we'll manage it or not, but we're hopeful we'll have a SURF Awards dinner this year because it's worth doing that kind of thing to recognise the endeavours that folk in Scotland put into changing their communities. If you're not on our mailing list, Emma and Derek and Christopher will take care of that for you. And can I just close, but again, reiterating my thanks to the 5 politicians for being here this afternoon and to all of our supporters and sponsors who help make these events possible. So with that, can I say thank you again to all of you. It's been a great afternoon. It's been interesting trying to chair it in this way. I'll watch question time in a new light from now on. But thank you again, and have a good day for the rest of today. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Cheers.
Emma's going to close it down now.